Let's get started with this afternoon's session about making predictions. So firstly, I'd like you to just have a think about these two words, hypothesis and prediction. Do you think they are the same thing, or do you think they are different? And what I'd like you to do is go to www.menti.com and put the code in at the top of the screen there, and just cast your vote for whether they're the same thing or different. So if they're the same thing, yes. If they're different, no. But what we can see there is there's a little bit of a split, but the vast majority sort of think that the prediction and the hypothesis are two different things. And then there's a few people that think they're the same thing. And I think that's depends on our level of experience. And I'll be honest, I looked up these things before I prepared this session, because these are two words that are used both in everyday life, but also in a scientific context. So it depends on how we're familiar with using these terms. So I'm going to flick over. So the next thing I would like you to then think about, and maybe the five of you who think they're the same thing, you're off the hook on this one. But I'd like you to think about, if you believe these things are different, how confident are you that you could explain what a prediction is and what a hypothesis is? And could you explain the differences between them, the similarities and differences? So I'm going to let you vote on that now. So how confident are you at explaining each of these things? Okay, so what we can see there is that people feel more confident to explain what a prediction is, less confident to explain what a hypothesis, and even less confident to explain the similarities and differences. And actually this is not a surprise, because we're much more familiar with the word prediction. That is what is talked about in our national curriculum, whereas a hypothesis is not a word that's actually in our national curriculum at all. So why would we have delved into that in so much detail? But I think it is important that you do have an awareness of the differences between these two, and that's what I'm going to go on to explain now. So we're going to be looking at how predictions form different parts of the science inquiry process. We've looked at this cycle before, where children start by exploring the world. That helps them come up with questions. They'll then be gathering the evidence to answer those questions and thinking about whether they can answer it and explain it in different ways. And predictions are used in different ways at different stages of the investigation and the inquiry. So let's just think about the inquiry process and how it works with these predictions. So we start by making some sort of observation. So for example, you might be watching two children going down a slide, and you notice that Ben goes down the slide more slowly than Gemma. So that's the observation that we've made. That will then lead, hopefully prompt the children or prompt you to think about, well, why? What's going on here? So the question, the general question is, why does Ben go down the slide at different speed to Gemma? So we've come up with a question. Then a hypothesis is one possible explanation for this observation. So it's an idea we have that we can then go on to test to give us evidence to support this hypothesis. So our hypothesis might be that Ben goes down the slide more slowly than Gemma because he's wearing different trousers. So that's our hypothesis. A prediction is slightly different. A prediction is an outcome that we'd expect based on a specific context. So our hypothesis is very general, and our prediction would be much more context-based. So for instance, if Ben changes his trousers, I think he will go down the slide at a different speed. So that is now a prediction based on a specific context. So then we need to move on, and we need to actually test our prediction, either by making further observations or by carrying some sort of test out. So it might be that we ask Ben to change his trousers, and then we measure or observe how quickly he goes down the slide. And then the thing that happens next will depend on what we find out as we're doing that investigation. So the results or our observations may either support our hypothesis or refute it. So if the results support our hypothesis, we can't say for sure that our hypothesis is true and correct, but it's likely to not be incorrect. And I think that's an important thing to think about, because our hypothesis was only one possible explanation. It is not the complete picture, so we can't prove it's the only answer to our observations. If the results don't support the hypothesis, then the chances are that our hypothesis is perhaps incorrect, and we maybe need to go back and formulate a new hypothesis. And then we get to the last part of the inquiry, where we actually reflect on our results and think about what we're going to do next. So again, depending on how our results supported or refuted our hypothesis, will mean that we respond in different ways. So if our results supported the hypothesis, we might want to do 4 more tests to confirm it, or revise it and make it more specific. So we might want to broaden our conclusion and think about, well, actually, it made a difference to Ben wearing different trousers, but what about Gemma? Can we broaden it out and see if it makes a difference more generally than that? We might also want to test a wider range of fabrics, and this will just help us get more of an understanding of our hypothesis and the evidence that supports it. If our results refute the hypothesis, then we need to come up with a new hypothesis. So for example, we may actually decide that it wasn't Ben's trousers after all. It's probably more likely that it was because he was lying down, whereas Gemma was sitting up. So we actually form a new hypothesis, and then we'll start the cycle again, making a different prediction based on a different context now. So hopefully I've explained to you the difference between a prediction and a hypothesis. So I'd like you just again now to go back and actually think about, are you more confident now to explain a prediction and a hypothesis and the similarities and differences? Okay, so difficult to tell from that whether you're more confident or not. It could be different people voting each time, but hopefully it's given you a chance to reflect on how you're feeling about these 2 words. You know, I didn't actually give you a summary at the end, so you know, maybe I've shortchanged you there. But for me, a hypothesis is a possible idea as to why an observation is as the way it is, and then a prediction is what we think will be the outcome for a much more specific investigation, and then that prediction will either support the hypothesis and give you that confidence that perhaps you have got some truth to it, or it may not support it and you need to start thinking about it again. So a hypothesis is more general, a general idea, and a prediction is much more specific. So now I want to think about the progression of making predictions, both generally and then more specifically with our national curriculum. So young children will make predictions without actually being asked to make predictions. And if you teach young children or have young children of your own, this may you may see this when a child goes, "Oh," and that's an indicator that what they just saw wasn't what they were expecting. So they actually had made some sort of prediction, but they probably didn't vocalize it. So you can be looking out for those little telltale signs that something struck them as odd. It wasn't what they were expecting. And I think to develop this, we can start asking them to think about, well, what do you think might happen? And then after they've made an observation, was that what you were expecting? And initially, those predictions, and I'm using the word in the everyday language, we're making a prediction, is based on their experiences. As we move through the school, as we're gathering more evidence and knowledge, then the next stage is actually we look at the evidence that we've got and we can make a prediction based on that. And then once we've started to build up a bank of knowledge, then we can make predictions based on our subject knowledge. And that's where moving away from experience into evidence and knowledge-based predictions is when they start to become scientific predictions. So the national curriculum follows a very similar process. In Key Stage 1, there's actually no expectation that the pupils are making predictions. That doesn't mean that you wouldn't ask the children what they think is going to happen or ask them to explain whether what they saw was what they were expecting or not, but there's no statement about it in the national curriculum, so therefore we wouldn't need to assess against that. Moving into lower Key Stage 2, you can see the statement there. They're using results to draw simple conclusions, make predictions for new values, and that's the bit that we're going to be thinking about in a moment. And then we move up into upper Key Stage 2, using test results to make predictions to set up further comparative and fair tests. So we're going to look at both those two aspects in just a moment. But firstly, I'd like you to just think about these four types of material or objects, and this is the way that you may do a prediction in Key Stage 1. Which of these objects do you think will mop up a spill the most effectively? And if you can rank them with 1 being the best to 4 being the worst. Okay, so it was clear that the plastic bag was 4th all the way through. And I think that is because we've all got a vast amount of experience that tells us that a plastic bag is not going to be suitable. You probably would recognize that it's waterproof and it's just going to be moving the spillage around. The other 3 you've probably also got experience with. I tried to choose objects that you would know what they are. Dusters remained 3rd all the way through as well, and I would imagine you're sort of thinking, well, a duster is suitable for dust, not for water or a liquid, so why would that be any good at mopping up a spill? Then the towel and the J-cloth, there was a little bit more movement between those two, although the towel did stay more consistently at the top there. And I think the idea of doing this with Key Stage 1 children is not because we're expecting them to use their subject knowledge, but we're getting them just to engage with the objects, maybe feel them, talk about them, think about what they already know about them. And then quite often you may have a discrepancy between what the children think. So for instance, with this one, some of you probably said that the J-cloth was going to be the best, and some of you have said that the towel was going to be the best. So here we've got that element of conflict between different children thinking about different things, and that means it's giving us a reason to do that investigation. It's giving us the reason to carry out the test, and I think that's one reason to ask young children to make predictions, is because it's a motivator for them to actually go on and do the inquiry. What we probably wouldn't be doing and focusing on is actually, if we're short of time, let's not bother with the plastic bag because we already know it's rubbish. What we want to do is focus on those ones that we're not sure about. So now looking at the national curriculum for lower Key Stage 2, we've got this statement here, and the particular bit that we're thinking about is making predictions for new values. So what does this actually look like? Children use their evidence to suggest values for different items using the same method. And there's an example there which we're going to think about right now. So I actually got my little toy car out the other day and I tested how far it traveled on different surfaces around my house, and you can see the results there. What I would like you to do is type into the chat, how far do you think the car will go on the glass table? And my glass table is extremely long should you wish it to be. Okay, it's as long as you want it to be. So yes, if you could just type onto the chat your ideas, but this time it's not a guess based on experience, it's looking at that evidence and using that to inform your prediction. Thank you, Kinga. We're going to unmute you in a moment. You are unmuted. Would you like to, could you just say what you thought was what your prediction was, and then explain why?
So I said that it wouldn't go further than 40 centimeters, and I'm thinking because the glass table is too slippery, and the wheels wouldn't have enough grip to actually move forward.
Okay, so sorry, what was your prediction?
40 centimeters.
Right, okay, so your prediction was very different from everybody else's. And I think, but the thing is, as you said, actually, if it's too slippery and there's no friction between the two, then that is going to give us a different result. I would say that you've actually used other experience and subject knowledge as well. You haven't just looked at the results. So that's really great. Can I unmute somebody? If somebody would like to, so somebody, most people, were saying that it was going to go sort of more in the 300 or 280 bracket. With somebody, Laura, could we unmute you, Laura? Laura Alexander.
Do I unmute myself?
Oh, you have. Lovely. Perfect, Laura.
So I predicted, I want to say 270, 280. And I considered the fact that actually the glass table would be smoother than a wooden floor, which is why I put it higher.
Yes.
I then looked at the difference between the kitchen tiles and the wooden floor. I considered them to be similar, but the tiles would have dips in it, the ridges between the tiles, which would slow it down. But I used that, the difference between the two, to make my prediction for the glass table.
That is perfect. And actually, I was going to put pictures of the different surfaces on there for you. And what you would have seen is actually the wooden floor, although there are obviously different bits of wood joined together, it is actually very smooth, whereas the kitchen tiles do have much more of a gap between them. And my glass table is totally smooth. So your thinking was spot on. With, if you'd have been able to see them, it would have been the case. But obviously, without trying, possibly Kinga might be right and there's not enough friction and it's going to go hardly anywhere. So we would still need to test it. But that's what it looks like at lower key stage 2. We look at the results that we've gathered and we can make further predictions. So in fact, in this instance, the prediction is happening at the end or in the middle of the investigation. It's not something that we do at the start. And that's sort of it's a little bit of a different approach to perhaps what we're used to. So then let's move on to upper key stage 2, and we've got we've got using test results to make predictions to set up further comparative and fair tests. And this is actually something that people do find a little bit more tricky. So we're just going to talk about what this might look like. So let's assume that the children have learnt about friction, either because they've done it in year 4 or because they've already done things moving on different surfaces and we've reintroduced friction in year 5. So the next activity we might get them to think about is possibly using a balloon rocket, as you can see there. And we'd give them a little bit of time to explore their balloon rocket, give every group a piece of string and a balloon. And what they'll probably notice is that their different balloon rockets traveled different distances. So that's the observation they've made as part of the exploration. And what they may, the question they're then thinking about is, well, what is it that's affecting the distance that the balloon rocket travels? So they'll then be coming up with a hypothesis. So they may be thinking that actually the distance is affected by the amount of friction, because that's what we've been learning about. That's what was making the difference with the previous inquiry that we were doing. And it's going to be the friction between the straw and the string. So that's our hypothesis. That's our big thinking. It's our possible explanation at this stage. And then we then need to turn it into a testable question. So how does the type of string, I'm going to change the type of string, affect the distance the balloon rocket travels? So I've actually narrowed it down to something that is much more specific and I can now actually investigate. Therefore, I can now make a prediction based on this particular question that I'm going to investigate. The rougher the string, the less distance the balloon will travel, because there's higher friction. So I'm using my subject knowledge from prior inquiry and I'm applying that in this specific context that we've now set up. So then, depending on the results that I get, I may well find that my results match my prediction and therefore they're supporting my hypothesis, but that may it's only one possible answer, so I might want to broaden it out and think about something different. So although I feel quite confident that it's to do with the friction, and yes, the string, type of string does make a difference, that may not be the only thing that's making a difference. There may be other variables that come into play. So actually I may come up with a new hypothesis or a further hypothesis where the amount of friction between the straw and the string actually also depends not only on the type of string but on the length of the straw. And then from this, I will then come up with a new hypothesis, a new prediction that the longer the straw, the less distance the balloon rocket will travel as friction is higher. There's more area in contact between the string and the straw. I would then carry out my investigation, and then depending on my results, that will give me further evidence to support my hypothesis or to refute my hypothesis. So you can see there that learning from one type of one investigation question has then been developed further in a second investigation question. So then we also need to think about, what does a good prediction look like? So I've got 6 versions of a prediction here. The activity that the children would have done or would be doing is thinking about having different sized umbrellas, and they're running off across the playground and they're thinking about how easy the umbrella is. When they're running across, how easy it is to run with those different sized umbrellas, and the umbrella is open. So I'd like you to look at these predictions and jot down the order from worst to best. You can either just jot them down on a little piece of paper, or if you want to type it into the chat, that's fine. And then I'm going to ask somebody to volunteer which one they think is the worst and why, and then we'll move on through there. Okay, would anybody like to volunteer which one they thought was the worst and why? Okay, Laura, you're volunteering. Can you either unmute yourself?
I've unmuted myself.
Perfect.
I thought it was the worst because, hold on, it was hardest.
It was B, you said?
I thought it was worse than E because of the way it talks about being carried. E doesn't really refer to the air resistance or it being harder or anything like that, but E referred to the umbrella being carried and that being difficult rather than the running.
Yes, I think you're right. It's B just talks about whether it's easy to carry the umbrella or not, and that's not our question. Whereas E does, and I think you've given me the 2 at the bottom there as far as which ones need more development. So B just isn't related to the question that we're investigating. And then E, I would suggest, is the next one. It's better because it is at least relevant, but it's not, it's just one, it's looking at that extreme. It's going to be hardest. And I think that's what we need to then move the children forward from. So the next one, I'll just talk through the rest of them, I think, because we're running out of time. So I would suggest that probably D is the next one. It's better than E because we've got that sort of comparative language. We're just not looking for the extreme. We're looking at a wider range. And then moving on to A, this is where these next 3 are open to debate, but I'll give you my thoughts on it, and we'll see where we go from that. So as the umbrella gets bigger, it will be harder to run. So we've got that comparative language because of air resistance. So we've got a word, we've got some key vocabulary in there, but for me, I'm not sure whether the child understands that key vocabulary or whether they've just seen it on the board and written it down. So I would definitely want to sort of explore that a little bit more. I would suggest perhaps that, oh, D, I forgot D, didn't I? As the umbrella gets bigger, it will be harder to run. So I would say probably D is not as good as A. I do apologize for that, because it's just answering the question. It doesn't give any sort of explanation, whereas A is giving an explanation. And then we've got C and F, and again, it depends on your thinking. That C shows an understanding of the concept of air resistance, the fact that the air is getting trapped and that's making it more difficult, whereas F is using the word air resistance. So we need both. I think that's the problem. We don't want to just be throwing the word in. We do want to show the that we have that understanding also. So you might want to show children examples like this and then get them to come up with the success criteria that will help them to make good predictions. So it may well be that a sensible set of criteria might be that it relates to the question. That's the first and most important thing. We want the children to use comparative language, not just looking at the extremes. We do want them to give a reason, so we need to use that word because or as. We do want them to be using scientific vocabulary, but also we want them to show that they've got an understanding of that vocabulary. Words may get forgotten, but is the concept, is that there? Is that secure? That's really important. I would probably actually like to refine that prediction even further. As the size of the umbrella increases, it's more difficult to run across the playground as there is more air resistance, but then I want them to go on and show that actually they understand that caused by more air being trapped by the umbrella. So we've got the word, we've also got that understanding sitting behind it. So that's the end of what I'm going to share this afternoon. What we're doing as part of the plan resources is trying to gather more examples for these working scientifically skills. So I would really like it if some of you are able to participate in this. If you have got access to books at home, or if you are popping into schools sometimes, if you can have a little look through and see where children have been making predictions, and just either photograph or scan, whatever you're able to do, something over to us with a brief description of what the activity was and the year group. And it's also, we'd be really interested in seeing some good examples, but also some less good examples, because then we'll be able to share these with teachers so they can look at them and think about how would we make these predictions better. So if you are able to contribute something along those lines, please do just drop us an email at admin@primary-science.co.uk, and that would be absolutely fantastic, and hopefully you'll be able to support us to develop a new resource for the plan website. So thank you very much. Hopefully the weather will stay nice and you can enjoy a nice bank holiday weekend, and hopefully I will see you next week. If you've got anything that you would like to share on the chat, please do post that now. We'll stay here for 5 minutes or so to deal with questions, queries, and that sort of thing. So thank you very much. Goodbye.